signed, whatever. And as a comedian, if you work for a while, you spot that there are just buttons you can press with regard to the peoples of the world, right? Because we basically, all of us have a list in our head of the countries we know, and we've one or two words beside to describe the people in them, right? Because we're busy people, we can't have fully formed impressions of all the people in the world, right? So it narrows down to a couple of very common phrases all the time, right? My friend from California, you may wish to block your ears just for a tiny moment at this stage, right? I'll give you an example. If I said to you, Americans, what are they like as people? Americans are fat and stupid. Those are the two things.
And I just want to begin by illustrating it from the new book. I just want to read a couple of paragraphs.
Oh, sure.
The current head of the NIH, that's Francis Collins, recommends that that's the National Institutes of Health in America, recommends that we believe the following propositions. 1. Jesus Christ, a carpenter by trade, was born of a virgin, ritually murdered as a scapegoat for the collective sins of his species, and then resurrected from death after an interval of 3 days. 2. He promptly ascended bodily to heaven, where for 2 millennia he has eavesdropped upon, and on occasion even answered, the simultaneous prayers of billions of beleaguered human beings. 3. Not content to maintain this numinous arrangement indefinitely, this invisible carpenter will one day return to earth to judge humanity for its sexual indiscretions and skeptical doubts, at which time he will grant immortality to anyone who has had the good fortune to be convinced on mother's knee that this baffling litany of miracles is the most important series of truths ever revealed about the cosmos. 4. Every other member of our species, past and present, from Cleopatra to Einstein, no matter what his or her terrestrial accomplishments, will be consigned to a far less desirable fate, best left unspecified. 5. In the meantime, God, Jesus, may or may not intervene in our world as he pleases, curing the occasional end-stage cancer or not, answering an especially earnest prayer for guidance or not, consoling the bereaved or not, through his perfectly wise and loving agency. Just how many scientific laws would be violated by this scheme? One is tempted to say all of them. And yet, judging from the way that journals like Nature have treated Collins, one can only conclude that there is nothing in the scientific worldview or in the intellectual rigor and self-criticism that gave rise to it that casts these convictions in an unfavorable light. Well, there's a lot like that in the book, which I hope is enough to recommend it, but
all of the other stuff, we had all the kind of Catholicism and all that kind of stuff, and even that gets on my nerves at this stage, because I'm not a man for text and holding to text really strictly, like laws and rules and regulations, and the Bible thing in particular. For God's sake, we've moved on, right? If you're a religious person, fine, go for that, whatever you're into. But at least in this part of the world, we don't take it literally. There's nobody like there is in America going, no, Genesis is a historical fact. And you're going, for God's sake, Genesis was just a load of fairy stories to get the kids to go to bed on a donkey ride to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, right? Stop taking it literally. It's only the Bible. It's not gospel. Not every word in it is supposed to be true, right? For God's sake. And people give out about evolution, right? This wonderful thing that we invented, and we came up with this fantastic theory to explain incredibly complex things. And people go, no, it's not in the book. It can't be right. And they other little arguments, creationist arguments like, how could the eye just have evolved? It must be a gift from God. And you're going, no, you're not getting the point. The whole point of evolution is that random things just happened and the useful ones hung around, right? Basically, there were loads of blind monkeys. And then one day, a one-eyed monkey wandered into the middle of it all and rode everything left, right, and centre. And he was king of the monkeys until Mr. Feckin' Two Eyes sashayed into the clearing. It's a wonder I'm not invited to more churches in Alabama to give that speech.
And I gave a talk about morality, and I argued, as I will here tonight, that morality must relate at some level to questions of human and animal well-being. And the moment we admit this, we can see that certain moral codes are in fact worse than others. And I cited as an example the misogyny and sadism of the Taliban as an example of an orientation that was obviously less good than others. And at the end, another invited speaker approached me and said, how could you ever say, from the point of view of science, that forcing women to wear burqas is wrong? And I said, well, because the moment you admit right and wrong has something to do with human well-being, then it's obvious that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not a good way of maximizing it. And she said, well, that's just your opinion. And I said, okay, well, let's make it easier. Let's say we found a culture that was removing the eyeballs of children, every third child.
Oh, what'd you find?
Meet Tinkerbell. She acts like a typical young pup.
Oh, you better get it.
Playful, curious.
Very much an explorer. She's a smart little feisty thing.
But Tinkerbell is not a typical dachshund for a few reasons.
Being that she's solid white is very rare. So this would be, under normal circumstances, a very desirable trait. The problem being that genetically this doesn't really play out for the dog. There's not really much eyeball in there.
She was born without eyes and is deaf, the result of bad breeding practices, according to Georgia Cameron, who rescues dogs like Tink.
She wants us to come play with her.
She says Tinkerbell is a triple-dappled dachshund. Veterinarians say it's a color combination that can result in severe birth defects and stillborn puppies.
Her issue is related to inbreeding and overbreeding of certain traits in dogs.
In an attempt to create the pure white coat, Dr. Angelina Piccoli says the breeder took big risks.
Breeding any animal that you know has a genetic fault with another animal that you know has a genetic fault or potential for a genetic fault is irresponsible, because you know that potentially half, if not more, of your offspring are likely to have something wrong with them. Why would you want to do something like that to an animal just for your own personal profit?
Nobody monitors breeding practices. So you could have, daughters breeding back to fathers, and there's nobody that's going to police that. And if anything, the AKC will register it.
We checked with the American Kennel Club. They say dogs are registered according to their bloodline, that a dog can have a genetic defect but still be a purebred. They say it is up to the breeder to distribute a sick dog like Tinkerbell and the new owner to choose whether or not to register it.
Does AKC mean healthy?
No. No. Most of the puppies that come out of puppy mills and go into pet stores are AKC registered dogs.
Papers don't give her eyes back, and papers don't make her be able to hear. Tinkerbell didn't have to be born this way.
Would you then agree that we'd found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being? And she said, well, it would depend on why they were doing it. So after my eyebrows returned from the back of my head, I said, okay, let's say they're doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they have a scripture which says every third should walk in darkness or some such nonsense. And she said, well, then you could never say that they were wrong. Now, you should know that I was speaking to a woman who was quite a sophisticated student of philosophy and science. In fact, she has since been appointed to the President's Council on Bioethics in the United States. She's one of 13 people advising President Obama on all of the ethical implications of medicine and progress in related science and technology. And she had just delivered a perfectly lucid lecture on the moral implications of advances in neuroscience, and she was especially concerned that we might be subjecting captured terrorists to fMRI-based lie detection technology. And she thought this would be a truly unconscionable violation of their cognitive liberty. So on the one hand, her moral scruples were really finely calibrated to recoil from the slightest perceived misstep in our war on terror, and yet she was totally detached from the very real suffering of millions of women in Afghanistan at this moment. So I view this double standard as a problem. And strangely, this is the erosion of basic common sense and moral goodness that religious people tend to be worried about. Now, I hope it's obvious to all of you, and will be even more obvious at the end of this hour, that religion isn't the answer to this problem. But it's inconvenient that the people who tend to agree with me about the necessity of a concept of moral truth are, by and large, religious demagogues and not our fellow secularists.
Genetic essentialism is the idea that our genes somehow have a greater influence and should be accorded greater weight than any other influence on our behavior or any other influence on diseases, etc. Likewise for neuroscience, right? The idea that it's all localized in our brain. If we could simply unpack the brain and get into that black box, we'd suddenly have discovered the answer to the universe. And I think it isn't that simple, and I think the idea of scientific essentialism is just as concerning, which is to say, if we had the answers to science, if we could unpack human nature, if we could unpack nature generally, we'd have answers to all of the hard questions we've been grappling with in life, like what is personhood, and what is agency, and what is identity, and what are morality and ethics and virtue, what's the role of religion in society. These are hard questions that science can't answer alone. It may be that science gives us some new insights, but it's just one part of overall societal advance and overall progress.
Right, but there we are back to those the problem with those words and the different usages.
Well, each of them gives the idea that we privilege what is objective versus what is subjective, and I'd say we can't think that somehow science is objective in a way that normative decision making isn't. Right? It isn't any more objective. It is another field. It's another angle. It gives us one more perspective on human behavior and nature and society. But the difficult questions aren't going to be answered by science alone.
But why would you need anything more than, as Pat Churchland would put it, constraint satisfaction problems being solved to end up with a system of virtue ethics and a system of morality?
Well, I mean, so if I can see that when you are making a moral decision, a particular area of your brain is activated, and that everyone, when facing a particular decision, say it's the decision whether or not to punish someone, a particular area of their brain is activated, that doesn't answer for us whether or not punishment is appropriate, punishment is good, the model of punishment that we have chosen is going to maximize human welfare, because we have to first say, what do we mean by human welfare? What are the values that we wish to maximize in society? And if we can localize it in the brain or localize it in the gene or understand the genetic and neurological components to what is human nature and what is human behavior, then we have one more factor that we can take into account in trying to come up with what we think will maximize the values we wish to maximize. But that conversation isn't one that's answered by science. It's one that's answered by normative discussion and thought.
Fat and stupid.